Tides of Torment is finally upon us, and the first thing it's bringing is a tidal wave of new units. The three factions are all receiving some much needed reinforcements, from new legendary lords to regiments of renown. Let's take a look at everything that's new and how they're best used in battle. And of course, if you want to skip around to the different factions, I'll leave chapters in the description. Starting with Norsca and kicking us off, we have the new legendary lord, Sail the Faithless. Sail is very much a pure spellcaster as far as combat ability. No real damage or defense to speak of, so the backlines will be his friend. From here, he can make use of his own mix of the Law of Heavens and Shadows, which grants him plenty of damage and a nice bit of utility to empower his army and weaken their enemies. Alongside this, he also has abilities to counter enemy spellcasters by dealing direct damage whenever they cast a spell, as well as buffing his allies and unleashing his Nightmare for some extra devastating magical power. If you can feed him Winds of Magic, he can do a tremendous amount of work without ever having to get his hands dirty. He has access to a Norscan Warhorse mount, and this of course grants him much more speed, but all this really means is he has an easier time avoiding enemies and getting into position for spells. He should still avoid combat at all costs, even more so with a larger size. The Marauder Chariot drops a little bit of that speed to gain some armor and charge bonus. He can now be used as a charging unit to move in and out of enemies to rack up a few kills in melee. However, only do this if he can stay on top of the micro, as otherwise he can go down fast with that low defense. The War Shrine Mammoth is the slowest of the three, but makes up for this with massive melee potential and even more utility. He'll empower nearby allies and keep them confident and fighting fit, and this only improves the more enemies fall around him. He can do well in melee, but with those lower stats, it's still not to be taken lightly. Pick lower risk combat to get some added value, but prioritize positioning him for spells and utility first. And of course, avoid ranged focus with that big old hitbox. The new generic lords are the Great Shaman Sorcerers. Just like Sail, these are pure spellcasters and are honestly even weaker, so should still be avoiding combat at all costs. However, they do have the choice of the laws of fire, death and metal, all three of which are very powerful in their own respect, so you can't really go wrong. Keep them on the backlines and casting to rack up value, whether by damage or utility. And they have access to the Norscan Warhorse, Marauder Chariot, and the War Shrine War Mammoth. The Norscan legendary hero is Bjorg Bearstruck. Weirdly enough, he's like a big old sentient bear, which makes him into what is essentially a bigger, slower, and more devastating werekin. He is a tank in melee with excellent attack and defense, alongside very high armor and damage. This makes him devastating against pretty much anything, regardless of what bonus versus large would have you believe. He can improve this even further with abilities to supercharge his stats, protect his allied lords and heroes, and improve his defense so longer he's in combat. Add on to that his regen and physical resistance, and he is borderline unkillable, making him great for tossing straight into the front lines to rip and tear until the battle is done. And the new generic hero is the Fimir Nobles. Compared to the Bale Fiends, they of course lose the spellcasting but gain a lot more power in melee. They have tons more armor on top of very high attack and damage. They deal magical, armor sundering, and armor piercing damage, so can cut through any and all defenses with ease. Their defense is a little low, but they will constantly increase this for them and allies as long as they're above 50% leadership, so it could be worse. They can also massively boost allied attack, so end up being excellent frontline damage dealers that also lift everyone up around them. Get them close to other melee damage dealers to maximize their value, and target tough units that may not have the most damage coming back, just to be on the safe side. Coming now to the new Norscan units, first up we have the Axe and Shield Marauder Bearmen. These are a strong in-between from Marauders to Champions, offering a good mid-game line holder. They have decent armor and melee stats, making them fairly strong defensively. Combined with their shields, they're damn good at holding the line against most weaker threats, though armor piercing will eventually cut them down in no time. Their damage output is pretty non-existent, even with any bonuses they gain from Norsca Rage, so you'll need something else to come in and deal all the damage for them. We also have the Great Weapons Marauder Bearmen. These drop the shields and some defense to gain a nice chunk of armor piercing damage. These are the choice if you want your melee infantry to be the damage dealers, but of course you are losing quite a bit of survivability. Generally, I go for tankier front lines when given a choice like this, as it allows me to build pretty much whatever I want for the rest of my army. However, if you prefer a more aggressive playstyle and are okay with front lines that die faster but take some enemies down with it, they're a great choice. Still temper your expectations, as they're still an early to mid game unit, but if you use them in the early to mid game, they should do pretty well. Next up, the Dual Weapons Kurgan Horsemen. They are blazingly fast and have fairly respectable melee stats and damage, as well as a little bit of charge, which is of course doubled if you charge into the rear of enemies. If they get into enemy backlines, they can clean up in no time, with this especially once you add on Frenzy and a bonus versus infantry and their rage passive. However, their painfully low armor means they can be taken out by the weakest pushback in melee or focus from range. This all makes them into an incredibly fragile cav unit that can only really be used on backlines and nothing else. Even charging the backs of the front lines is high risk with defense so low. Still, for that one task they are pretty fantastic, as long as you pretend that warhounds don't exist. Great Weapons Kurgan Horsemen drop some attack to gain armor piercing and a little bit more charge. Technically, this increases their damage, but dropping the defense on something that's already this fragile is a risky game. I'd stick to charging to make the most of their bonus and devastating flanker. Backlines are still the safest bet, but with armor piercing, the backs of the front lines look a little bit more manageable. Just keep them on the move and do not let them take part in sustained combat, otherwise they will die extremely quickly. Next, the Dreadmaw. Aside from being a little bit shy, this is a very powerful hybrid weapons monster. It has decent range missiles dealing armor piercing and poison damage, allowing it to soften up enemies from a distance. It can also deal excellent damage in melee with great attack and damage, alongside being relatively tanky with okay defense and armor. I'd still not send it in as a 1-unit army, as defense isn't the best in the world, and if its leadership breaks, it will shatter completely, so keep an eye on how it's doing at all times. With this combo of high damage, it can sneak around underground, making it unable to be attacked, but of course being unable to attack itself. Then when it comes out, it can attack, but is unable to move, so it's a bit of a tricky playstyle. This allows it to get into position safely with ease, especially with that high speed, vanguard deployment, and stalk. All in all, it's a very fantastic and weird addition to the roster and brings some sorely missing ranged firepower in a very elusive package. The Chimera is a pretty straightforward flying melee monster. It has very high speed and lands with a hefty impact from that charge bonus and decent mass for a unit its size. Once there, it has very high attack, dealing flaming, magical, poison, and armor piercing damage, meaning nothing can stand up to it for long. Defense isn't the worst, but just like the Dreadmaw, don't let it get pinned down completely, as it can still be taken down with enough focused damage. There's not really much to say about this, as it is essentially a much better Feral Manscore. Use Flaming Breath to soften up your targets before sending into a clump to get busy. The Cursed Etin compared to the Giant is a little bit weaker offensively, but stronger defensively, at least as far as stats concerned. However, once you take into account its dual personality, things get a little bit more interesting. When above 50% HP, it gains more bonuses to speed and charge speed, alongside a glorious charge and unyielding assault for more damage and leadership sapping ability. Essentially, when it's healthy, you want to use it like an ogre, moving in and out of enemies to make the most of its powerful charge bonuses. With the lower speed, this can be a challenge, but it can be worth the added effort, as long as they don't get stuck and take more damage than they need. That said, they still have very strong attack and damage, along with plenty of defense and HP, just be cautious their low defense doesn't get exploited by ranged, as they'll go down fast if under focused fire. Once it drops below 50% HP, it drops some defense, but gains bonuses to weapon damage, alongside some very slight regen. This makes it even better for sustained melee, but just as good when charging, so pick your poison. Lastly, it has some Vanguard, so maybe go for a cheeky sneaky flank if you're feeling fun. And lastly, the rune called Cursed Etin. This drops some stats from the base unit, including quite a large chunk of armor piercing damage. This obviously makes it worse in melee, but it can still be a decent threat, so don't disregard it completely. However, now it also has access to 3 bound spells to keep them relevant. They have a couple of buffs and some damage, making them a little more utility focused than damage dealing, but still they can help out your front lines a ton by weakening enemies and making them easy to get rid of, even if they don't contribute quite as directly. They still have their dual personalities, and as I said, are still decent melee threats, just use a little bit more caution as they won't mop up quite as easily or survive quite as long. And lastly, we have the Norsca Regiments of Renown. The Worshippers of the Crow are a great weapons marauders unit. They are blessed by the Mark of Nurgle, granting them poison damage, several stat buffs alongside the Swarm of Flies passive to weaken nearby enemy attack. The Followers of the Great Eagle are a Marauder Chariots unit. They are blessed by the Mark of Tzeentch, granting them barrier, magical and warp flame attacks to reduce enemy armor and weakness to fire. The Riders of the Mighty Serpent are Marauder Horsemen. They are blessed by the Mark of Slaanesh, granting them immunity to psychology, strider, resistance, and improved stats. Alongside this, they also gain the Battle Songs passive to increase the leadership of nearby allies whenever they're close to enemies. And lastly, the Bloodshriek Chimera is a Chimera, and this isn't blessed, so I guess get shit on corn. However, it gains the Perfect Predator ability, allowing it to gain stalk and healing to bring it back to full health whenever it's outside of combat. Next up, Slaanesh. Kicking us off, we have Dakala, the new legendary lord. Dakala is essentially a souped up herald of Slaanesh, and her stat card reads just like one. Stat improvements across the board, making her faster, more deadly, more tanky, and more confident. She's a speedy melee charger and battler, capable of tearing apart backlines or front lines with ease. Her only downside is low armor, so keep an eye out for ranged focus or elite melee hostiles, as even with her high defense, she can still go down surprisingly fast. Alongside all of this, she has abilities to switch between more damage, more defense, or more armor depending on the situation, and of course, who can forget her Whirlwind of Pleasure Vortex for even more damage output. The new generic lords are the Chaos Sorcerer Lords of Slaanesh. These are pretty much exactly like the regular Chaos Sorcerer Lords, but have a little more speed and of course, the lore of Slaanesh. Keep them well out of harm's reach, only engaging in melee if you can find something with basically no chance of fighting back. The lore of Slaanesh has some great damage and utility that pairs excellently with the heavy charge playstyle of the faction. The most important thing for this lore is timing, so as long as you can manage that, you are golden. Lastly, they also have the ability to silence enemy casters, which can be pretty useful to shut them down for a short while. They have access to the Chaos Steed, which grants them more speed, charge and armor, but still want to be used much the same. Just use that high speed to keep them out of danger and get into casting position even faster. The Demonic Steed is even faster and has even more charge bonus, and now has a little bit of melee defense. However, the major change here is much more favourable armor piercing damage, which makes them a lot more viable to use in some light charging. I still wouldn't send them into melee and leave them there purely because of their size and value they can get when mobile. And lastly, the Chaos War Shrine. This drops the speed and almost all other stats to transform into a mobile buffing station. If you want to deal constant damage based on how many entities die nearby, and increase allied leadership, this is the mount for you. Not as mobile, easy to focus fire from a range, and useless in melee, but if you want something that can sit still and get value, this is the mount for you. Next up, the Slaanesh legendary heroes. First up, we have Striker of the Source Veneer. This guy feels a little bit strange in the Slaanesh roster because he has no real charging ability, at least not immediately. He's a fairly basic frontlines battler with very strong defensive stats and fine but not great damage output. Early on, he's a decent presence in the front lines and will reduce the stats of everything he attacks to soften them up for others. His abilities allow him to empower himself and allies, especially if something is rooting nearby. For his mounts, he has a Steed of Slaanesh. This grants him more speed and charge bonus at the cost of a small amount of defense. This makes him a lot stronger at taking on back lines with his less than armor piercing damage, being more than enough to take out most missile troops. The front lines are now a little bit more dangerous with the low defense and larger hitbox. And a Demonic Steed. The Druchii Anointed are kinda like Slaanesh / Dark Elf Lore Masters of Hoeth. In melee, they're excellent damage dealers with armor piercing, anti-infantry damage, add on decent defense and high armor, and they're also pretty tough, making for some great units for tossing into the front lines for some added damage. On top of this, they have bound spells for some added damage and buffing ability to get even more value for either themselves or allies. For their mounts, they have a Colder One, which grants them more speed, charge bonus and armor, and makes them into charging melee battlers. The melee stats are still strong, but the larger hitbox does make them a little more vulnerable if they get pinned down. Stick to charging if you can, or send them to fight something without much coming back if you can't manage the micro. And a Demonic Steed. And lastly, the Exalted Hero of Slaanesh. Compared to the neutral Exalted Heroes, they have stat changes you'd expect. Faster, more charging damage, but less attack and armor. Still strong frontlines battlers that can stay alive for a very long time and do okay damage versus less armored targets. They also lower the attack of nearby enemies with their Glamour of Slaanesh, so work well to weaken nearby enemies. For their mounts, they have the Chaos Steed, Demonic Steed, and Chaos Chariot. This drops speed and melee stats from the Demonic Steed to gain a buttload of charge bonus along with some armor. This makes them into charging machines that want to be constantly on the move and avoid sustained melee at all costs. If you can't handle the micro, I'd probably stick with one of the steeds. Coming now to the new Slaanesh units, and first off, we of course have Slann Gauls. Finally, the collection of Gauls is complete. These have a moderate amount of armor along with some decent speed, charge and melee stats. They're much better suited to charging rather than sustained melee, especially against anything that can fight back with their low defense. Plus, whilst their leadership is high, they gain more speed and charge bonus, so it really adds up if you keep them moving. Plus, the more damage they take, the more speed, charge and attack they gain, so can keep it up all battle long. The Devotees of Slaanesh are a bit of an odd unit for the roster, as they're technically more expensive than Chaos Warriors, but have drastically less armor in exchange for a little more speed, some anti-infantry bonus, and moderate charge. This makes them into vulnerable chaff shredders that can wipe out less armored troops in moments. However, their Murderous Euphoria passive allows them to increase their damage significantly whilst in melee to get them killing even faster. Still quite fragile, but sustained combat against less threatening targets is the way to go to get value. The Crossbows Devotees of Slaanesh have the exact same melee stats as the regular Devotees, but also gain some medium range crossbows. This gives them a nice chunk of armor piercing range damage, though not the most ammo, so be sure to focus on key targets to maximize their value. They also drop the Murderous Euphoria, so won't be quite as deadly in melee once they're out of ammo. Speaking of which, keep them at a range until they're out of ammo to maximize their value, then send them in as support infantry for some added damage versus infantry. Pleasure Seekers are the new final form of cavalry in Slaanesh, and they are quite a sight to behold. They are incredibly fast and have a devastating charge before we even consider the doubling power of Devastating Flanker. Their armor piercing, magical and poison damage make them able to break enemies in a single charge depending on the target. They're best used for cycle charging, as their lower armor can give them trouble even with their high defense. If you send them into backlines, then sustained combat is fine, but charging will always get the most value possible. And as an added bonus, every wavering or lower enemy nearby will grant them some slight regen so they can keep themselves healthy, no problem. And lastly, they also have Vanguard deployment and Strider, so sneaky flanks are a piece of cake. Next, the Champions of Slaanesh. These are essentially the Slaanesh version of aspiring POG champions. They drop a ton of armor, HP and little leadership, but see considerable increases to everything else, mainly melee stats and armor piercing damage. This makes them into devastating melee combatants, but of course they're also excellent chargers. With Devastating Flanker, they can tear units apart and stick around afterwards to stomp whatever is left. They're a fantastic unit that can really do whatever you need them to, so you can never go wrong in picking them up. And lastly, the Praeton. This is a charging flying monster that really wants to be used to cycle charge as much as possible. The bonus is decent, but the real problem is the low defense. If you leave this thing in sustained combat, it will take a ton of damage, especially with only moderate armor. However, if used right, it can make the most of its massive anti-large, poison, armor-piercing damage to plow straight through most targets with ease. Large is obviously the better target, and especially single entities, to make the most of that huge charging impact, and having less risk of being pinned down. It also buffs its own damage whenever nearby enemies are routing, and you can choose to swap some melee defense for melee reflection for a short while to give anything that gets close a nasty surprise. For the Slaanesh Regiments of Renown, we have the Heralds of Excess, they're a Seeker Chariot. They gain perfect vigor, so can charge or battle long without fear of getting tired. The Pleasure Guard are champions of Slaanesh. They're now unbreakable and gain even more damage and charge, along with unyielding assault, so their attack can never be lowered. And the Scourge of Arden is a Praeton, it gains Strider, and the ability to hide in forests if you want to use it to be extra sneaky. And lastly, we come to the High Elves. First up, the new legendary lord, Sea Lord Azelin. In his base form, he's a pretty standard frontlines lord. Not the most damage, especially not armor piercing, but great defense, and against less armored infantry, he can clean up. He's more of an army leader than a battler, and can grant his ranged units double their range and a massive boost to their damage output for a short time to give him an edge. As well as this, he can give any nearby broken units a huge boost to their leadership and cause them to immediately rally. This is great for keeping his army in the fight, even when things may not be going his way. Lastly, he also gives all nearby units some missile resistance, so it's a great choice to plop into the middle of your front lines. For his mounts, he has the Skycutter Chariot. This drops most of his melee power, and in return he gains flight, high speed, and some decent charge bonus. This changes him from a frontline bulwark to a flanking flying chariot. You want him to move in and out of melee to maximize his value, as his defense will quickly falter if tested in sustained combat. Plus, he gains extra mass, speed, and charge bonus whenever he's zooming around, so he really is built for this. You can also choose the Star Dragon. This drops a little more speed and charge bonus to make him into a well-rounded melee monster. You have Star Dragon Breath for some added ranged power, and he's a great melee battler with massive damage and toughness. Just look out for enemy ranged, otherwise he'll get picked apart. The new generic lord is the Sea Helm. These are pretty basic frontlines lords, even more so than Azelin. They're defense focused with high armor, a shield, and high melee defense. Attack is okay and the damage is fine if they're against low armor, but they're never going to be hyper carries. Instead, they're simply there to hold the line and encourage allies to maintain a front line. For their mounts, they can choose the Great Eagle. This grants a lot more speed, charge bonus, and damage, as well as the obvious flight. He's still not a one-man army, but the damage is certainly a lot more usable, albeit still against less armored targets. I'd say backlines or weak lords and heroes are the way to go to maximize their impact. They can also choose a Skycutter Chariot. The new legendary hero is Caradhrian. This guy is another extremely tanky frontlines hero, but also comes with some respectable armor-piercing damage. The melee stats still skew towards defense, but whilst he's keeping himself alive, he can throw down pretty dang well. He can deal great damage whilst also empowering nearby enemies and himself to take down enemies with ease while staying in tip-top condition. For their mounts, they have the Barded Ithilmar Steed. More speed and charge bonus along with even more armor. This makes him into a great speedy battler that can engage in the front lines just as easily as he can hunt down priority targets. Enemy cav or other lords and heroes are great choices to make the most of this stacked stat card. The Ithilmar Chariot has less melee stats and much less armor piercing damage, but gains a bunch of charge bonus. Honestly, not sure if it's worth it even if you're great at charging, as the difference in armor piercing is too great to overcome with any amount of bonus. And lastly, he has Ashtari. This grants him super speedy flight along with boosted melee stats and the usual armor piercing damage. He's now quick to get around the map and can take on just about anything he fancies, as long as he doesn't get pinned down and taken apart. Add on his massive Blizzard Aura debuff to enemy speed and damage, along with the addition of magical and frostbite attacks, and not much can get away from him. The new generic hero is the Mist Mage. These are pretty pure spellcasters with no real combat ability outside of spells, and those aforementioned spells are from the new lore of Mists. This is a lore full of utility with a splash of summons and damage here and there. It would work best with quite a mobile army to make the most of various vigor and speed buffs, alongside some missile power, as it can make enemies a lot easier to hit. For their mounts, they have the Great Eagle and the Skycutter Chariot. Coming out to the new units, and we have the Shipped Company. It always feels a little bit underwhelming to announce a new lowest tier unit in a faction, but here they are. These are the new cheapest and lowest tier melee infantry in the High Elves, and they're really not that bad. Compared to Spearmen, they drop a little bit of armor and a lot of defense, but they gain a little bit more attack, damage, and charge. They're not going to win fights against basically anything that's a real melee unit, but they can hold the line and get their licks in for a little while until you get them some help. Not the most exciting, but hey, everyone loves a bargain. The Oceanids are a bit of a weird unit, as they have no armor and instead rely on various forms of resistance. They have fairly high defense alongside low attack and some okay damage. This means they are defensive units with no armor, and even with that defense and resistance, they will still die pretty quick. Fair enough their HP is quite high, but still, once they get in focus fired, they will start to feel the burn, so avoid enemy ranged as much as possible. On the bright side, they have perfect vigor, nice speed, and strider, so if you want to use them to flank for some reason, it's very much on the table. Just make sure their leadership stays high, otherwise their elemental traits will cause them to evaporate before your eyes. We also have the Sea Elemental. This is pretty much a large single entity Oceanid, and whilst the focus is still more defensive, this also has some actual damage. We're talking armor piercing with a bonus versus infantry, decent attack, and even a tiny bit of charge bonus. It's still not going to be a powerhouse of damage, but it can keep the enemy focused for quite a while, provided there's no range threats, and do some decent damage whilst it's there. It can also increase its own and allies' defense versus missiles, and lower enemy defense and leadership to tilt the scales a little bit more into your favor. Lastly, at low HP, it spawns a weak unit of Oceanids that explode on death for a little bit of added value as the end approaches. Again, keep leadership high or it will literally turn into a puddle. The Merworm is essentially the high elf version of the Dread Saurian. It's massive and has a ton of HP along with devastating damage, making it extremely hard to kill and very deadly to anything that gets close. With its size comes a slight lack in maneuverability, making it a little easier to get trapped and a little slow to attack, but when it does, it can tear units to pieces in a single move. Just be aware of it being a giant target, as defense and armor are not the best, so focus from a range or in melee can cause some trouble. This is helped by the Abyssal Cloak, granting it and nearby allies missile block from every direction, which is pretty strong, along with reducing enemy leadership. Sprinkle on some regen and it can stay alive for quite a while, as long as you do your best to keep it safe. Next up, the Bow Northern Skycutter. These have tons of speed along with a decent bit of charging melee power, but if you want to make the most out of ranged power, you want to keep them at range at all times if possible. From here, they can use medium range and decently damaging magical missiles to whittle down enemies from a safe distance. However, if you really wanted to min-max, then sending them charging whilst firing at will allow them to get melee value whilst also firing off shots whenever they have an opening. However, keeping them at a range and shooting is just as valid, not to mention far easier. As long as you keep them out of sustained melee, they should be fine. And lastly, the Bolt Thrower Northern Skycutter. These keep the same melee power but swap the bows for a slightly weaker version of the Eagle Claw bolt throwers. They have a relatively high range and highly damaging projectiles, along with the ability to switch between single and multi-shot depending on the situation and target. These I would keep at range and use their speed and flight to get them into strong firing positions. Switch ammo depending on your target and focus on priority targets to make the most of their ammo. Of course, avoid melee and being focus fired, and try to use as much ammo as you can before resorting to melee. And lastly, the High Elf Regiments of Renown. The company of the Calandrinian is a ship's company, and these drop the shield to gain attack, armor piercing, and martial mastery. They're essentially great weapon ship's company, which begs the question, why not just make that? But here we are. The Blades of Hearth are a Swordmass of Hearth unit, and they gain Guardian, magical attacks, and spell resistance. Essentially, they're great for defending your army leaders and taking on more magical threats. And Psylach the One-Eye is a Merworm. It gains the Enfeebling Cold ability, slowing and reducing the attack of nearby enemies, essentially making it harder to kill or get away from. And that's every new DLC unit coming in Tides of Torment. But what I want to know now is, what is your favourite of the new units coming with the DLC? Personally, I'm a big fan of the Dreadmaw, but maybe you're more of an Oceanid head. Let me know in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and if you want more Warhammer 3 videos, then check out this one all about the top 10 best heroes for battle.